Welcome back to Inside Ambition, a casual news show where we talk about all things Drexel. I'm your host, Alexandra George. By now, I am sure that everyone is well aware of the virus that is ravishing the globe. And if you're not, first off, how? And second off, cut your Wi-Fi and cable immediately and just stay indoors. It's best that you don't know what's going on. This pandemic has people really starting to worry about what the presence of coronavirus could look like on college campuses come the fall. Little do they recognize that there is already an epidemic that has been infiltrating college campuses for decades: sexual assault. Ooh, you thought that was going to have a better punchline. I'm sorry. The Trump administration has finally announced its Title IX regulations after a year spent reviewing comments on the original draft. I know you were all super excited about these new regulations and are completely up to date with it all. So that means I don't have to tell you about the fact that they made it significantly easier on the accused and a lot more challenging for survivors to come forward. So we can just talk about sunshine and rainbows and the fact that flowers are starting to bloom, right? Wait, what's that? You had no idea that any of this was happening because your news feeds have only been focused on Corona? Ugh, well then. I guess here we go. Now let's take an inside look. The new Title IX regulations narrow the scope of complaints that colleges are required to investigate. Over 12% of college students experience sexual assault or rape, and that's before taking into account the fact that many survivors never report. So even though the whole world is burning, this still matters. Some officials did recommend to Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos that she hold off on announcing these regulations until the whole world calmed down a bit, but she argues that civil rights can't wait. Good on you, Betsy. Title IX is an educational amendment that was added in 1972. It says that no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be discriminated against under any education program that receives federal funding. That means that pretty much all of our parents, except of course for Stacy's mom, were alive before there were federal regulations condemning discrimination in education on the basis of sex. That just seems archaic to me. You may know Title IX as the federal gender equity law that allows women to play football. But obviously they can't because women are too weak and don't look as appealing under all that padding. And the law that also makes all sports fair and equal, even though the last time I checked, the NBA doesn't have a gender modifier. But a huge part of Title IX is that it concerns sexual assault. I know you might be wondering, why does Drexel care about my sex life? Well, they don't to some extent, no offense. I mean, even Mario the Dragon is on Tinder. But they do when it comes to the fact that we are students before we are sorority sisters. Only in the eyes of the law, FIMU. My apologies. And sexual violence and assault can prevent equal access to education. Equal access to education is something the university cares very much about. In a roundabout way, it's the same as trying to convince your anti-vax uncle that it's important to be pro-choice. Sure, he doesn't care about women having rights over their bodies. I mean, who does? But he and his wife/cousin want to have the right to choose whether or not to vaccinate their kids. And it wouldn't make sense for him to continue to be pro-life for obvious reasons. So now he cares about being pro-choice. For the most part, universities will also have the right to choose how they want to enact these regulations, but some aspects will be required. For example, it now requires colleges to hold live hearings for sexual misconduct complaints and allow cross-examination. Cross-examination was discouraged during the Obama administration because advocates for sexual assault victims have said it can be traumatizing and can dissuade people from coming forward in the first place. Not to mention, equity comes into question when some students may have the money to afford lawyers when others won't. The University of Michigan at Ann Arbor has already begun implementing these cross-examinations in Title IX hearings due to 2018 court mandate. Even though they received roughly the same number of reports of sexual harassment and assault in 2019 as the year prior, far fewer students chose to pursue formal investigations. Instead, they opted for an informal resolution process that doesn't result in any sort of punishment. This is great because it encourages survivors to come forward, but The new Title IX regulations say that no matter how many informal complaints have been filed against the same individual or group, a formal investigation cannot be completed unless there is a formal complaint. But how does that make sense? If 15 Karens complained that they saw a rat in the kitchen at your local McDonald's, you would want them to do some serious deep cleaning before you step foot in that McDonald's again. And honestly, a complaint to a manager and the informal complaint process don't differ that much. An informal complaint usually results in an apology from the accused to the accuser, and the accused completes an education program. For all of you that got caught drinking by your RA in the hall in your freshman year, you know what kind of education program I'm talking about. Speaking of RAs, or resident assistants, you may already know that they are mandated reporters. A mandated reporter is someone who is legally required to report any suspicion of abuse or neglect. If you lived in a residence hall your freshman year, your RA would have made a point to tell you that they are by no means a confidential source. Sure, you can go to them to cry about how your boyfriend cheated because the long distance got too hard, but when it comes to your safety, RAs are required to help you get the help that you need. The same applies to coaches, university officials, and professors. However, with these new regulations, that is no longer the case. Cases will only need to be pursued if the accuser brings it up with a Title IX coordinator, which makes no sense. Survivors are more likely to talk to someone they know will support them. Why would you want to recount something like that to a dean or an administrator you've never met? By now, it's probably starting to become clear to you that the changes made with these regulations make life a lot easier for the accused. The odds that there will be a formal complaint filed against you are a lot slimmer, as survivors are going to be a lot less willing to come forward. And you'd be right. After all, the Secretary of Education herself, Betsy DeVos, a key component of this legislation, has said that the previously existing system was unfair to the accused. I mean, why wouldn't she? She's working for a president that has had 25 women come forward to accuse him of sexual harassment and assault. These new regulations also detail that universities are no longer responsible to investigate cases where students were assaulted off campus. This even means that if there was an assault that occurred between two Drexel students taking part in a Drexel-sponsored program, but abroad, the university would not be obligated to follow through. That's like saying you stole from the company you work for, but the company isn't going to look into it because you were staying in France and you hacked into their accounts in Italy. What? And how would this work with ACC housing? Technically, that qualifies as on-campus housing, but it is not Drexel-owned. And besides, the majority of students at Drexel and other universities across the country live off campus. But if Title IX is trying to protect students from discrimination when it comes to their education, why would it not continue to cover students when they're living off campus? Are they no longer considered to be a student while they're staying at their residence? Just because an assault occurs off campus between two students doesn't mean that it won't affect their education. What if they're also in class together? But listen, I'm by no means saying that Drexel will not follow up with these cases. For the most part, these new restrictions are pretty lenient and leave a lot of discretion up to the universities. They just seem to bring the standards for handling sexual assault cases down from a 10 to like a -69. And honestly, I have faith that Drexel will continue to uphold the standards it has always had when it comes to protecting its students. The new regulations also change the definition of what qualifies as sexual harassment. It is now defined as any unwelcome conduct that a reasonable person would find severe, pervasive, and objectively offensive, which, surprise, is a lot more narrow than the one the Obama administration used. They define sexual harassment as any unwelcome sexual conduct. And I'm not saying that the definition didn't need some adjustment, but I am of the belief that sexual harassment is something that can only be defined in the eyes of the survivor. If you feel violated, you feel violated. And to me, that's enough. Also, what does this definition mean when it says any reasonable person? How can you define who is reasonable and who is not? And can't that change? Reasonability is all a matter of preference. Sure, I think that it's reasonable that my 87.5 be boosted to a 90, and I mean it rounds up when you're looking at the nearest 10, but my professor doesn't think that's reasonable. This definition also means that universities are no longer obligated to look into lower level sexual offenses before they turn into something more serious. These changes and more will take effect on August 14th. Between now and then, Drexel and the rest of the nation's universities have to work out how these regulations will be implemented at their schools. When the draft was initially presented, there was an open comment period where people like us could submit suggestions for change. Unfortunately, that period is long gone, and these are now the standing regulations that the federal government wants universities to put into action. So please make sure that you are paying attention to these regulations and how Drexel plans to implement them. I know it may seem like it doesn't matter right now, but you'll say that until these regulations matter to you. Make sure to keep all of this in mind when you head to the polls this November, or more likely when you're filling out a mail-in ballot in your room. Civil rights shouldn't have to be political, but here we are. To stay up to date with all our content, make sure you subscribe and follow our Instagram at inside_ambition. Thanks for watching, stay safe, and we'll see you soon.